sure they're on track, being implemented, help advocate for funding for these types of projects in LA. And, you know, it's really exciting to see the track that we've progressed upon since 2001 and the inroads that we've made. And I'll have to say, you know, we see devices like this, a approved full capture device. This is just one example for board member Dinamo that you can see what the technology looks like. And, you know, we see these popping up all over LA. And it's really exciting because I think the cities are really proud, and you can see when they present on these TMDLs that they're really proud of the accomplishments that they've made, and as they should, very well should be. You know, that most of them are on track for compliance. We haven't heard, I'm at every single Region 4 board meeting, and you know, we don't hear concerns about that. And look at the great success we've seen in the city of LA. This is just in 2013, one city, the city of LA, reporting you know, over 1 million gallons of trash withheld from getting into our oceans. That's a pretty exciting big deal. And multiply that by all the TMDLs that we have, and that's a pretty amazing statistics. So that just goes to show what this policy could do on a statewide level. It's pretty exciting. But with that, we do, you know, in general, we do have very strong support of the proposed amendments, but we do see the need for some modifications and clarifications. So we thought our best use of the time today would be to take some of those main concerns and proactively give some suggestions of how we think that they could be modified and clarified to really get the most effective policy. So right here, this is addressing the full capture idea. You know, we've seen such success in LA, and we've seen the great inroads that the full capture devices have made. So why go to something different? You know, if we're seeing something effective, let's use it and go with it. And so, you know, my preference is that we just see a situation like track 1, which is really in line with the TMDLs. But we do understand that there are circumstances, and speaking with some of the city engineers, that there sometimes are those technical infeasibilities where you just can't fit these types of systems without some significant reconstruction. And so we understand that. So what we propose is that we really focus on doing the full capture in both of the tracks. But at the end of the day, if there is that technical infeasibility, then you could pursue that combination of other measures. So that's different than, you know, what staff is proposing for track 2, but we really want to see an emphasis on the technology that's working. And so this is the language change that we propose to get at that fact. And of course, you know, it would take the operation and maintenance. That's a lesson learned, that those systems need to be maintained and operated in order for them to be effective. But we think that is an important change to the proposal.
Before you move off that,
yeah.
So is it your proposal that it would be the regional board and or state board that would have to make that determination of technical infeasibility?
Yeah. Well, that's one thing that I believe is in the document we handed out, that we would like to see some kind of definition in the SED as to what constitutes technical infeasibility. For example, that's something we see a lot in the low impact development ordinances that have been developed, is that there actually is a definition. So it's not just, you know, any old person saying, you know, oh, doesn't work there, but there actually has to be some criteria. So we'd be happy to work with staff to define what that would actually mean. So the next point really hits what Board Member Dodek was mentioning in her previous comments. We're concerned that as track 2 is laid out, it's not really clear that track 2 is going to have the same impact as track 1 to us as proposed. And so we believe that we need to look at what scenario of full capture and the volume reduction achieved under that full capture scenario, and really quantitatively make sure that if track 2 is pursued, that it's equivalent. And so we need some sort of standard, performance standard evaluation, and a strict monitoring program to really show us that that equivalent and the trash reductions that are proposed from, you know, institutional measures or whatever they may be is really getting us there. And I would suggest that you look towards the Region 4. I know they've worked closely with the City of LA on developing a study to do just that for some of their remaining percentages where it was technically infeasible. So you might be able to get some good ideas out of that, and I'd be happy to work with Steph on that as well. But we really believe that these language changes will help clarify that we need that performance standard, and we need to have a baseline with minimum monitoring and minimum criteria to make sure that that is actually an equivalency. Okay. I think this has gotten, we're going to come back to this. And then with the LA trash TMDL, you know, we've obviously been very involved in these TMDLs over the years. We do appreciate that the policy exempts the TMDLs, you know, for many reasons. They're being effective. LA is a very large urban environment in our state, obviously, with a lot of trash pollution. And, you know, we've made great inroads there. So why stop a good thing when we're so near to compliance for all of these TMDLs? The one concern I have is that the proposal does pull out only the LA River and Ballona Creek for a reconsideration or a reopener. And as you know, the regional boards, if there's an issue with any TMDL, it can be reopened. We've seen this already in Region 4 for various TMDLs. So we don't think that there's really a need to specifically force the regional board to reopen any TMDLs if they're working. So we would request that you, you know, remove that entirely and just have the blanket exception. And if the regional board so deems it needing to be reopened, then that can happen. But if you do feel as though you need to move forward with this type of concept, here's a proposal for some language changes. But like I said, we would prefer just not having that mandatory reopener. We really don't see the need of this. So this would basically take the approach that, you know, if the regional board sees that a TMDL is about at the 80% compliance level, then they could reassess, you know, what could be done for that remaining, you know, 0 to 20% if it's so needed. But that's not our ideal scenario, but just sort of an in-between suggestion. The last point that I'll make before turning it over to Sean is non-point sources. So as your policies proposed, basically it punts on the issue of non-point sources to the regional board's discretion. And we think this really needs to be addressed head on by the state board. You know, we've seen non-point sources addressed in the LA region TMDLs. You know, beaches, obviously. If any of you have been to a beach, you know, say the day after a holiday weekend in Los Angeles, we've gotten dozens of calls recently just saying, oh my gosh, something blew up at, you know, Santa Monica Pier because there's so much trash everywhere. And so our recommendation is that we make sure we do look at those trash hotspots because non-point sources are a big contributor. It shouldn't be ignored and left up in the air. And so our suggestion here in this language is that we have a trash hotspot survey that's conducted to look at areas within the municipality where there could be a problem. And in addition to that, we really believe, due to our experience with our cleanups and what have you, that we really need to make those high-use beaches, and our suggestion here is possibly those as defined in AB 411 to make it clear-cut, to have those high-use beaches and those homeless encampments, two of the really hotspot areas that we see across the board and statewide, really have those come in under the policy as a hotspot, in addition to the those that are established through the survey. So, do you have a question?
Yes. what's involved in a trash hotspot survey? And do you have a estimated cost, or does it depend on the size of the municipality?
Yeah, I don't have an estimated cost, but I bet there'd be some good data from Region 4 because, for example, the Malibu Creek TMDL, the parks in that area, the national parks, and the beaches in that area are a big contributor to the trash. So they were included under the Malibu Creek TMDL. And so they basically develop a plan and have things like a minimum frequency of collection. So they have to make sure that they're, emptying their garbage cans at a certain frequency and basically figure out where those hotspots are. So those studies have been done in LA, and I'm sure could serve as a great example for this type of approach.
Yeah, building on that, so that's the hotspot survey aspect, and you touched on the implementation, implications. But you probably have then other suggested language, because there needs to be, this is one thing, but then there needs to be some sort of clear path on what a hotspot survey generates in terms of implementation actions, permit conditions, et cetera.
Sure, yeah, definitely, and we'd be happy to work with staff. I think we have some lessons learned from the LA area that would be really helpful in this discussion, but definitely. Okay, and with that, I'll turn it back to Sean, who's going to talk about NERDLs.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sean Bothwell. I'm the staff attorney for the California Coastkeeper Alliance. We represent 12 California waterkeepers statewide, all the way from San Diego to the Humboldt Bay. Before I touch on this slide, just to talk more about Member Moore's question about the implementation, the reason we didn't touch the language is because the language already right now says the regional board will right now has the discretion to address those through WDRs, and so we didn't know if that was appropriate to kind of fine-tune what the regional board wanted to do on a WDR basis. And so we were really just trying to get at, the regional board shouldn't have just full discretion. There should be something they're looking at, like a hotspot survey, so that they know where the hotspots are and they can address those through WDR. So that was our thinking on that language. But we're happy to work with you further if you would like more criteria on implementation.
Well, that speaks to my question is that, where does this link to? Because when you get into, the objective or level, TMDL level, there needs to be an implementation path. So you've answered the question in general. Those authorities would be looked to refine, at the regional board's discretion or state board on the statewide stuff.
That's right. And yeah, and I think it's more appropriate for them to be done on a case-by-case basis than for us to provide criteria now.
Okay. Well, I think it's a very important issue. It's just having been there in the trenches like you all. I think we need to take that comment seriously.
Right.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So pre-production plastics, or NERDLs. There we go. So the section in the policy that deals with this, there is a provision in there, and we've touched on it already, that there's a prohibition against general trash for industrial and construction permittees, and that this provision here allows the executive officer of a regional board to terminate that that prohibition and allow them to do track 1 or track 2. So this raised a couple concerns, and this slide is more, we would like some more clarification on these issues rather than us directly require this language, and maybe we can talk about this at the end. But there's two things in this provision. The first part is this first edit you see, termination, and currently it says of permit coverage. And so I'm not trying to push any policy here, but I believe what the board was trying to get at is that the EO has the discretion to terminate the prohibition, but the permit coverage still exists. They still need to be required to do stuff under their permit. So I'm hoping that was just a misstep there, and we can clarify that, but we can talk about whether that was a mistake or not. And then the language down there at the bottom is really just to be explicit that this exemption, this termination of the prohibition, does not cover pre-production plastic pellets. So at the very beginning of the policy, there's several prohibitions. One is for general trash, where the permittees can do track 1 or track 2 to come into compliance. But then there's an outright prohibition for pre-production plastics on number D in that section. And we would just like here to re-emphasize that the executive officer does not have the discretion to terminate that prohibition, only the one for general trash. All right. So getting to my main slides, this is an issue we have been discussing since the very beginning of the PAG meetings, and actually before during the scoping meetings. And now that we're in a public meeting, I thought we would just reemphasize it here. And that is that we really need the effluent limit to be enforceable. And we think the best way for it to be enforceable is to set a standard of 0 trash in the waterways. And the reasoning for this comes from what's been going on in the LA Regional Board and their TMDL, where they set a 0 waste load allocation for trash in the water bodies. And when you read the lawsuit that followed this decision and the way the case interpreted it, they looked at several interesting things that the Regional Board did to conclude that 0 was appropriate. And the first one was the Regional Board found that littering is illegal. You're not allowed to litter no matter what, not one piece of trash. And if that's the case, then 0 should be the only defensible standard that you implement. The court upheld that and found that that reasoning was justified for why a 0 trash limit should be appropriate here. The Regional Board also pointed to there's no study out there that says any level of trash can exist and the beneficial uses or nuisance isn't impacted, right? The study, one piece of trash can impact beneficial uses and can be a nuisance. And you know, the reason behind that is trash is different than the other pollutants that we deal with on stormwater. You know, it's not turbidity, it's not salts or whatever it might be, metals. Trash doesn't break down. It does break down, but not to an extent where it doesn't impact beneficial uses. It doesn't dilute in the water. It's one piece of trash can be a nuisance. And the court, again, upheld that fact that there's no studies that saying that trash in a waterway can uphold beneficial uses. And then the third thing I wanted to point out from the Arcadia case is interesting. And what we've gotten from during these PAG meetings of why they won't go to a 0 numeric effluent limit is because of this idea that if there's just one piece of trash in the waterway, then that's an enforceable issue and the permittees won't be in compliance, that it's impossible to comply with a 0 effluent limit. That's the point. What's ironic is the cities in LA, with this court case, argued the same thing. And the court came back and said that a 0 waste load allocation is possible to achieve because the TMDL sets up compliance methods for them to achieve that 0 waste load allocation, right? You do the 100% full capture devices, you're found in compliance with the 0 waste load allocation. Well, the same thing is going on here with this trash policy. Right now, it's a narrative effluent limit, and there's a prohibition against trash. But there's compliance methods, the 2 tracks, to allow you to say you're in compliance with the prohibition. It's the same thing that's going on there. And so to us, a 0 effluent limit is actually the most legally defensible position that the State Water Board can take based on that past decision in the court upholding the 0 waste load allocation in LA. We realize, though, that that the State Board might not change to a numeric effluent limit. So we provide this alternative language down below. And the reason behind it is, if you read the staff report, it says that this effluent limit was created by looking at all the basin plans and all the water quality objectives and coming up with this one effluent limit. Well, when you look at the table, not once is the word accumulate used in the water quality objectives. No one uses that word, accumulate. Almost everyone uses the word shall not contain. And so we would just like, the way the wording is, I used shall not be present, but I'm fine with shall not contain. That is the language that all the other basin plans are using, and I think that's more detailed. I feel like the word accumulate is vague and quite frankly unenforceable.
Could staff comment on this?
So there's a couple of things to comment on this. One is that we're not, Sean using a term loosely, we're not setting effluent limits with our, we're setting a narrative water quality objective. And the first proposal I interpret is to set a numeric water quality objective of 0. I believe, though, I will let Michael talk about how that relates to the issues in the law cases on the TMDL, which is our targets and not water quality objectives. So I think there are different issues. On the second one, that's something we can consider. I don't see any real big difference in my mind between the two. So.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is, as John indicated, I mean, the cases are fairly carefully nuanced, and during the litigation of the Arcadia decision, which was the original Los Angeles River Trash TMDL, and the specific issues that were teed up for it, we actually were very careful, and in the court's ultimate decision, we were very careful to sidestep the issue of whether or not it truly was a zero receiving water limitation. There it was a target, which, as you recall from our discussions, I believe it was 2 weeks ago with the Santa Maria TMDL, you have that fine line between what's a target, what's a load allocation, a waste load allocation, and then ultimately what becomes the effluent limitation in the MPDES permit. So I think the latter part that John just mentioned with respect to accumulate versus be present is something that we can certainly listen to the comments on, and that's part of the reason why we go through the workshop and hearing process in order to figure out what is the most succinct, clear way to express this type of narrative effluent or narrative water quality objective.
I'm just trying to understand this, this recommendation fully, or at least understand it better. From what you said, you cited that because installation of a full capture system is deemed to be in compliance, that
What does it get you?
yeah, so should, for example, a municipality install the full capture devices, and yet, trash is found in the waterways within its jurisdiction. So in theory, I guess, according to the law, because they have the full capture system device installed, they're deemed to be in compliance. But what's deemed to be in compliance may not necessarily actually be the actual case if you actually have trash in the water. So wouldn't adopting such a zero effluent limitation set up a conflict situation between what is deemed to be in compliance and what may actually result?
Yeah, I understand. I think for us, the difference of zero or just what the effluent limit is, even though there's a different compliance path to get there, it's more of a backstop, is the way I look at it. So,
And why would you need a backstop if installing the device is deemed to be in compliance?
because once this program's done, you're 10 years in, if there's still trash in the waterways, if we haven't reduced trash to a level, even, let's just forget the zero for a second and say that we're sticking with what's proposed right now. The way I see it is these are backstops, and that when everyone is in compliance after 10 years, I like to consider it in the idea of a TMDL. When you're done with the TMDL compliance schedule and you're done, the regional board needs to go back and look to see if you've actually achieved that waste load allocation. And if you haven't, then you need to modify the program to do it. And so it's a little different here because this is going in, the ocean plan and the enclosed basin estuaries. But the idea to me is the same, where when they go back to revise the ocean plan and you can see that there's still trash, or even right now, trash is accumulating in the waterways, then to me that's a backstop to say, okay, State Board, we need to modify the trash program so that we achieve that water quality objective.
And so what's the difference between a zero backstop and a non-accumulation backstop?
To us, it's just more specific that, I have an issue with just shall not accumulate because I don't know what that means exactly.
I don't know what zero means because zero is not always achievable. In fact, it's if it were achievable, we wouldn't have the deemed in compliance if you install a full capture device.
Again, I would go back to the way the LA TMDL is set up, that they do have a zero waste load allocation, and when they're all the full capture devices have been put in and there's still trash in the waterway,
Yes.
my feeling is the regional board would then have to reassess how to get to zero.
I guess that was my way of saying I still would need to be convinced with
Understand.
respect to this particular recommendation.
I understand. What else? All right, moving on. to the
Actually, I'm
se-
sorry, before you move on, though, could you go back 2 slides? I'd like Jonathan or staff to clarify the prohibition. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Hi, this is Greg Gerhardt, DWQ. The way that this is structured is, first of all, the language is correct as written, not corrected, that its termination of permit coverage was the intent. And what that means is the industrial and construction permittees, this is a statewide general permit, they enter into it through a process of notice of intent and what have you, and then they exit out of it under a termination process. What that language that was added at the end of that section was meant to do was say, oh, when you submit your application for being terminated, this is, I'd say 95% as construction facility scenario, because all construction permittees end up terminating at some point because they're done with the construction activity. So this is first of all, I should have framed it, 95% or something like that of all of these cases are going to be construction sites. Occasionally we get an industrial facility that also requests to be terminated. The intent here was to say we won't we won't approve that request for termination unless you demonstrate that you've met all the conditions of the permit, including an ongoing maintenance plan for that. So that was the idea, that you don't just get out of the permit and thereby the requirements by submitting your termination request saying, I'm done with my construction or I'm done with my industrial activity. So that language was intentional to be termination of permit coverage. I think it's getting confused with some of the other language about prohibition and what have you. This was not meant to get at that prohibition. It was basically saying when you request termination, you better demonstrate that you've met all the conditions.
Yep, it's the
the
NOT process.
Exactly, and the
Notice of
termination would apply to the end of the construction or the end of the industrial use of the facility.
That's right.
Since we're on this, can I just get clarification on just making sure that the termination of the prohibition only applies to what I'm calling just regular trash and not the pre-production pellets prohibition?
Yeah, that is correct. There's a strange thing that goes on with the pre-production pellets that at some point they start out as a source material for industrial activity. They're not really trash. They come in as a raw product. And then at some point they could turn into trash because of a definitional issue. So, and there are instances where, I shouldn't say always, it's not going to apply to the pre-production, but in some instances it may apply to pre-production if that's what happened, is it turns into a trash particle. But this was intended to deal with the larger issue of trash, or the larger community of trash.
I'm going to try and be more clear, because we did a prohibition on pre-production plastic pellets because there is there are some donut holes in our permitting coverage that don't allow us to apply the state law that's already in place. I can't remember the bill number, but it's a pre-production pellet requirement that we do certain BMPs for pre-production pellet control at industrial facilities. And that is in our industrial permit, and we follow that. This doesn't change that. But then there are places where that doesn't apply. The classic is railroad sidings. Railroads are not under our industrial stormwater permit. They're excluded under the, nationally. And so there's a clear prohibition of discharge so that we can go directly and enforce that prohibition instead of going through a process of determining that we've proved there's a nuisance and that there's a problem, and, so it's just a clear prohibition that we can enforce. So those two pieces were put in there for the pre-production pellet because they're a little different than normal trash.
If I can just jump in and add on to John's, the number he was looking for was AB 258. And the nice thing about these workshops is it gives us a chance to find out areas where we thought we were clear and the public doesn't see it quite the same way. So I'd like to offer myself up to Sean, and we can do some wordsmithing together and make sure what we mean to say, especially in the IGP, CGP language, translates
Great.
the way we meant it to.
Thank you. Good. Next issue. So during the stakeholder workshops that we had last spring, one of the issue questions that the State Board wanted to resolve was how do we handle the Los Angeles Trash TMDL and the San Francisco MRP program that's in place? And they're really the two trash programs in the state that are already working towards coming into compliance. There's mixed reviews on what should have been done, and so I think we left those workshops not knowing who's going to be exempt, who wasn't. And the State Board staff decided that the LA TMDL would not be covered under this policy, which we appreciate and thank staff for, but decided that Region 2 should be covered under the policy. And so we have some certain issues with that. If you look at the Region 2's trash program, they require a 40% reduction by 2014, 70% by 2017, and I believe it's 100% by 2022. If this policy were to cover the MRP and not exempt it, not carve it out, that would give all those permittees an extra 10 to 15 years, as we were discussing with the compliance schedule, an additional 10 to 15 years to come into compliance with the permit terms that they already have. So we don't feel like that is an appropriate thing to allow them to do. The other issue is that the Bay Area has actual targets, 40, 70, and 100% reductions. And what they were required to do is come up with a baseline of how much trash is being discharged and then reduce it by that 40, 70, 100%. This policy doesn't necessarily do that. It requires them to reduce trash to the equivalent of track 1, demonstrate same reductions in trash. That's not the same as what's required in the Bay Area. And so in the anti-dig section of the staff report, there's a paragraph in there about how there isn't any issue because basically track 2 in this policy is fairly same to the program in the Bay Area. And I would disagree because of those 2 points. They already have these mandatory compliance times that they need to meet. This gives them the policy gives them an extra 10, 15 years. And what they have to show to reduce trash is different than what they have to do under this policy. So in our minds, we're concerned that this would constitute backsliding because there are already permit terms and this policy would relax those permit terms. So what we're asking is that the Bay Area's MRP program be carved out and be exempted from the policy.
I'm sorry, before you move on, I would like to sit down with you and understand your recommendation better with respect to the San Francisco Regional Water Board's program, because I can tell you that I, for one, from what I know so far of the implementation of that program, would be very concerned about exempting the Region 2 program from this trash policy. And I've had some discussion with the executive officer and some of the board members there, and I appreciate your issue with respect to the time to get into compliance. And obviously, if we go forward with the staff recommendation to not include Region 2 in the exemption, I would like to discuss that time aspect. That if a municipality is actually doing what they need to do during Region 2 and will achieve the results in a more efficient time frame, I don't want us to be the one to cause a slowdown. But there are, at least based on my understanding, some real serious concerns with a lot of things in terms of the implementation right now in Region 2. And at this point, I'm not comfortable with just an exemption, but obviously I'll look forward to reading your comment and having some follow-up discussions.
Yeah, and I would agree. I understand where your concerns are coming from. I agree that the implementation has not been working. I think from what we're coming from is just from a legal point of view, the MRP does have these compliance deadlines that they are required to meet under their permit. There are these % reductions that they are required to meet. You're right, they're not meeting them. The implementation's been not done well. But like you said, maybe there's a way we could work together.
I think I do understand and do share your concern with respect to the timing and the compliance deadline. I'm not sure, though, that just merely including them in the exemption is the way to solve that issue. So that's one area that I do want to follow up on.
We should continue to look at the language, but our desire, our approach was we'd set a maximum in there. And so the maximum is no more than 15 years from the adoption and no more than 10 years from implementing permit. And so it doesn't say that they have to eliminate their milestones or their timing in their permits, but they are permits. And so when the permit comes back up for renewal, there is nothing that says that the regional board can't change the timing in their permit. It's not a basin plan amendment, it's a permit. And so that's why it's different than what happened in Region 4.
Oh, that got confused. Okay. So we were talking about this earlier. It's a tricky issue, as Jonathan explained. This idea that you have 10 years from when the policy's permit term or terms are implemented into the permit, but no longer than 15 years after the policy is adopted. I want to first just thank staff for at least putting that 15-year cap on there. That was one of our concerns that we've seen stormwater permits that they don't get renewed every 5 years. We know this. The industrial permit was like 15 years before it got adopted. And so our biggest concern was it would be 25 years before anyone would be coming into compliance with this policy. And so we are thankful for the 15-year cap. What I tried to do here was come up with a creative way to put everyone on equal footing. And there's two reasons for this. One, it kind of lessens that time of the 15 years. But more importantly, we were concerned that different municipalities, different permittees would be required to come into compliance at different times. And just out of an equity perspective, we felt like that wasn't fair. I'll give you an example. So the San Francisco Phase 1, I believe, is looking to be readopted fairly soon. And San Diego Phase 1 was just adopted. So let's say that Region 2's permit is adopted right after this policy's done. They would get 10 years. They only get 10 years to come into compliance, while San Diego would have the additional 5 years before they would have to come into compliance. And just out of an equity sake, I feel like it would be better if they're on the same footing. The other reason I feel like this is a good idea, and I should explain the language. So this provision we've already talked about, within the year and a half, the regional board can either reopen the permit or give notice to the permittees that they need to come up. They need to start identifying what track they're going to do and start doing this implementation planning. I just changed the language so that they would be required to do both by the year and a half. And so that would really give everyone, the 11 and a half years. Everyone would be on the same footing, 11 and a half years to come into compliance with the policy. Getting back to my second reason for why I think this makes sense, after this section, there's various kind of compliance interim schedule issues. You have to start making a plan. You have to tell them what track you're doing. I think I would be a lot more comfortable if they started doing that stuff with these policy provisions in the permit itself, rather than before it's implemented into the permit. I feel like that puts everyone on a square footing, that it's in the permit. You know what your permit terms are. Let's go forward from here. So it was our creative way of trying to, allow the compliance schedule clock to start at the same time for everyone.
So I have a question of
Yep.
staff on this. Is there, so your example was a hypothetical about San Diego, or is that in fact, okay. Then I don't need to ask beyond that. Thanks.
My last thing I'm going to touch on is the interim milestones. So to the credit of State Board staff, when this policy came out, I wasn't, for once, there was not one thing in there that I didn't know was going to be in there. They had kept me very informed, let me know from stakeholder meeting what things they were considering changing. This was the one thing that was surprising to me that I didn't realize was happening. Throughout the PAG process, I believe that these 10% interim milestones, 10% for 10 years, were required in the policy. When it came out, it's more of a suggestion that if you want, you could do these milestones, but no one's required to do them. So I took out the suggestion language that they could be done to make them mandatory. And I think the reason for this is, again, compare LA to the Bay Area. LA is required to show 10% reduction for 10 years. And because of that, they're ahead of schedule, they're complying with the policy, it's working well. if you look at the Region 2s, you know, there are still interim compliance deadlines, which is great, but because of the length of them, you know, they had several years before they had to show anything. We're now at the first compliance deadline and no one's done anything. And that might be the result of some other issues. But I think it shows why 10% mandatory milestones is important. And, you know, they have to show the reporting every year anyway. You know, just make this mandatory that it's 10%. And if no one has any questions, I'll turn it over to Miriam Gordon.
Good morning, Miriam Gordon, the California Director of Clean Water Action. I just have 2 issues. I'll try to be brief. The first is on the issue of microplastics. It is our feeling that, in essence, microplastics, there's sort of a de facto ignoring of the issue of microplastics in the proposed amendments, because the performance measure is the full capture device, which screens for all trash 5 millimeters and above. Microplastics are the trash that's below 5 millimeters. So even though there is reference to the problem of microplastics and the definition of trash would include microplastics, there's nothing that addresses microplastics in the proposed policy and amendments. Microplastics there are a wide array of sources of microplastics, not just the industrial pellets and powders that are used for processing plastics that are addressed in AB 258. But there are also the small pieces of plastic that are the degradants of larger trash plastics floating in our waterways. And studies performed by Algalita Marine Research Foundation and the LA and San Gabriel rivers showed that there are a wide array of small microplastics, not just the pellets. And we even have a picture of them on the slide. Just little tiny pieces of plastics that come from hard consumer plastic products and films as well. There's also, we've discovered recently, another class of microplastics that are the intentionally added microplastics in things like personal care products, face scrubs and exfoliating products, and who knows what else in the future. Consumer products manufacturers will find other applications for microplastics. And I think they're also used maybe in sandblasting. I may be off on that. But anyway, the proposed policy and amendments do not address these. So we suggest adding to the resolution reference to the fact that microplastics are an ongoing issue, and that the board would identify this issue to be addressed in its stormwater strategy initiative, and work with the initiative stakeholders to determine how microplastics can be addressed through better integrated watershed management, multiple benefit solutions, source control and improvement of the regulatory program. The board could recommend that the governor sign into law AB 1699, a bill specifically banning microplastic additives in personal care products and things of that nature. So we recommend that the state board support regulatory efforts to eliminate the addition of microplastics that are intentionally added to products. And there's a huge body of research accumulating on the impacts of microplastics, both on marine life as well as threatening public health through the ingestion of microplastics and the accumulated toxins both on their surface and inside the plastic. So lots of reason for addressing this. One other issue. So actually, could you advance the slide? I do it. Thank you. Could I advance the slide? Where, could you help someone? I totally don't know which button it is. Oh, here we go. No, wrong one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh.
And so finally, thanks, Sean. Last point, just with respect to the staff report addressing in section 5 the reasonably foreseeable methods of compliance that are listed. So, you know, track 2 does allow for permittees to opt for institutional control measures. There's some reference to source reduction, but there isn't really any description of source reduction or source control measures. We would recommend that there be more of an elaboration of the types of source reduction and source control measures that are available. So we all know that there are bag bans and foam bans. The report needs to be corrected. There are now 108 local jurisdiction single-use plastic bag bans and 78 foam bans. So those numbers need to be updated. But we would suggest that a section, and I want to correct this section number, we'd suggest that a section 5.2.5 be added that elaborates on the types of source control methods. So it could include bans on trash generating products like single-use plastic bags, foam, or microplastic microbeads. But in addition, there could be other approaches, not just bans, but mandatory discounts on reusable alternatives to single products, such as a discount provided to customers that bring reusable cups or containers for takeout food, or a mandatory fee on the disposable product that becomes trash, like a disposable cup or a container or cigarettes. One of the reasons that we would include these options is because in Clean Water, in my organization's research on trash on Bay Area streets, we did a study of trash on Bay Area streets in 2011 with 4 local jurisdictions. We found that 67% of the trash on the street is takeout food and beverage packaging. Although we did not collect data on cigarette butts, they were too numerous to count. So we would say that cigarette butts and takeout food and beverage packaging are the most prolific sources, types of trash on Bay Area streets, and most likely in other commercial, high trash generating area commercial districts. So these are just some of the types of source reduction methods that could be used, and it would be helpful, I think, if the report referred to, elaborated a bit on that. That's it.
Thank you.
I think that concludes all of
Okay.
our.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and I especially find this document very useful with specific suggestions.
Felicia was a big fan of those, so I thought I'd redo it for you guys here. So I don't want to take any more of anyone's time, but these are some of the questions that we had. We also submitted a list of questions to staff, so they can answer those offline. But if there's anything we want to discuss here, we can discuss. But I don't want to take up anyone's time.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
thank you.
Good. Hey, real quickly on the microplastics issue, which is substantive, I wonder what staff thought about, is it fairly straightforward to kind of add that to the pre-production plastics type, framework, because it's a similar
No.
technical challenge. No, but I understand it's a different
Yeah.
policy challenge, but the technical challenge is similar, I mean, in terms of as an engineer, an engineering solution or not, it's just, it's something we can't ignore, but we need to recognize somehow.
So, as John alluded to, there's kind of layers of how we regulate plastic in California, and the one that was carved out in the legislation, AB 258, dealt with a small number of facilities. In my mind, it's 300 or so around the state of California that are subject to the industrial general permit and handle plastic as a pre-production product. And recognizing that that's not really addressing the issue of plastic in California, staff has fought hard to try to get other tools in place, and this plan amendment project allowed the suggestion of a prohibition of, an outright prohibition of discharge of pre-production pellets. The challenge of defining what is plastic is one issue alone, but then dealing with a breakdown product that might not be a small microplastic when it starts out is especially challenging. So I think another answer could be that we have a lot of thought put into controlling trash in general. Plastic falls into trash, and therefore, in our mind, microplastics that are produced as a result of breaking down bigger chunks of plastic, those are also essentially controlled. When they get so small that they cannot be either removed from stormwater or filtered out of receiving waters or what have you, it becomes very challenging technically as well as practically as a regulatory agency to define how to deal with that. So,
And I was glad to see that the, you know, the multi-benefit, you know, low-impact development, kind of interception of stormwater was mentioned in those, in that discussion, because, you know,
that does work.
That does
actually
work.
will filter out any amount of plastic that is in the water.
Yeah, if you separate the, you know, the conduit from the land surface to the waterway through low-impact development, you are creating quite an engineering barrier.
I just add that I would agree with what Greg said. We do see the technical
Yeah, that's it.
problems with quite
Sorry. I'm sorry. We did have an hour set aside. They had asked for an hour set aside for the group that had been working on as the PAG, as the Public Advisory Group, and we went a bit over, but it's largely because we had questions, and I think Tam has another one.
Yes, but actually, even though this was, I mean, and like Board Member Diodamo, I appreciate the presentation very much, but the four speakers represented, I think, one perspective of the PAG. And I'm trying not to put other people on the spot, but there are other PAG members sitting out there. I don't know if you've, were providing or thinking of providing comments, but I would love to hear, I see Tim and Jeff and others, so would it be possible for us to spend a little bit more time and get perspective from other PAG members?
Yes, I think so. That was our hope.
Please.
But currently, they haven't turned in their cards, so they need to turn in a card.
Well, they can turn in a card afterwards.
Okay.
I think Tim is coming up.
Yes, they are in the agenda.
So thank you. Good morning, board members. My name is Tim Shustek. I work for the American Chemistry Council. And just for a little bit of background, our member companies represent a broad spectrum of industrial manufacturers, from raw material producers all the way down to companies that convert raw materials into a variety of different packaging material and other products. So we run the gamut of plastics producers, those that are involved in paper, biodegradables, and compostable materials. So first of all, I want to applaud the board and board staff for the effort to establish this uniform statewide policy. We think it's important to have this consistency in this uniform policy. And I also want to recognize the board's efforts to outreach to potentially affected stakeholders, not just through the Public Advisory Committee process, but also the various workshops and meetings that were held throughout the state. We're still currently